Good evening and happy Budget Eve to you all. My name is Matthew Kilcoyne and I'm the Deputy Director of the Adam Smith Institute. This budget was meant to be the start of the Great Unlocking, and whilst the Prime Minister has announced a roadmap to the end of lockdown and the beginning of normal economic life, this budget in many respects will be a placeholder budget. One replete, however, with spending pledges and large promises, it seems, of future tax rises. After a year of lockdowns and restricted revenues, the private sector had been hoping for a budget that might free them up, might free up the market economy to get going again. But the Chancellor's outriders appear to have different opinions, with leaked tax rises and on corporation tax, lower sort of spending pledges on or suggestions for lower reliefs on different rates and raids on various reliefs planned and pushed in the Sunday papers. One of these, the corporation tax rise, is seen as the most likely to be implemented and the least likely to meet resistance from the public at large. Opinion polling suggesting that both windfall taxes and large-scale rises on the rate are very popular with the public. As a response both to the pandemic and more generally in the anti-business mood. But what signal would the tax rise show? Why is the Chancellor ignoring calls from the left, the right, all the major political parties and previous prime ministers to avoid raising taxes at a time of economic crisis while the economy remains closed? And why is a Conservative government looking at imposing austerity on the private sector? To discuss all of this and more ahead of the budget tomorrow, I'm joined tonight by Tom Clougherty, the head of tax at the Centre for Policy Studies, and in a previous incarnation, a version of me at the Adam Smith Institute. Also joining me is Emma Revel, head of public affairs at the Institute of Economic Affairs, John O'Connell, the chief executive of the Taxpayers Alliance, and Daniel Button, of the vice president of global projects at the Tax Foundation from Washington, DC. As ever, we're going to be taking questions from the floor. The little Q&A and the chat function are live. We'll be monitoring both, but please send questions that you have coming in into the Q&A. We've got a couple as well already in, and I can say from the attendees that we have an eclectic guest list from right around the world, including some incredible economics professors. So if you've got some great questions coming in, that would be great. But to begin, I'm going to go to Tom Clougherty from the CPS to give us his sort of State of the Union economy and what he thinks the Chancellor should be doing tomorrow. Over to you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Well, look, I guess our essay question tonight was effectively, why is it a bad idea to raise taxes now? And it's a good question. It's one people should be asking, but it's also a very strange question because I'm not sure anyone outside the government, maybe even anyone outside the Treasury, really thinks we should be raising taxes right now. That even applies to people on the left who generally favor higher taxes and a bigger state in the long run. And I think this consensus that we shouldn't be raising taxes right now is quite easy to understand. After all, we're still in lockdown, in case people hadn't noticed. The pandemic is still with us. Even if there's light at the end of the tunnel and some cause for optimism, there's still a great deal of uncertainty about how the rest of this year, the next 6 months, is going to unfold. Put that together with the fact that we're trying to bounce back from the deepest economic contraction, I think, since the Second World War. We have so many businesses that have effectively been on life support for the last 12 months. And of course, we hope that they'll be able to bounce back. That was really the whole point of the economic support schemes that the government put in place to try and preserve the structure of the private sector economy through the pandemic until it could reopen. But I think even the optimists among us expect there to be quite a lot of job losses and a spike in unemployment as those business support schemes inevitably are unwound. Businesses are going to have to adapt to a very changed world than the one that they went into this pandemic prepared for. So all of these things suggest to me that raising taxes, least of all on business and on investment, is kind of the last thing you would want to do. And so I don't really want to belabor that argument because I suspect my fellow panelists and many, if not all of the people watching at home are going to broadly agree with that perspective on things. But maybe it's worth trying to understand where is the government coming from? Like, what is in the Chancellor's mind or those around him who are leaking all these stories to the Sunday newspapers about the massive tax increases that business should be prepared for, coming down the line? And I think that, there's a few things going on. I would say, first of all, the Chancellor is, in my estimation, a very genuine, heartfelt fiscal conservative. He's someone who's uneasy with deficits and public debt and genuinely worried about passing on a fiscal burden to the next generation. And I think in normal times, that would be a very creditable sort of set of attributes for a Chancellor to have. We'd salute that. But now just isn't really the time to prioritize that kind of approach to the public finances. I think there are concerns about the long-term fiscal sustainability of the British state as an aging population puts, increasing pressure on the welfare state. That is a problem that we're going to have to deal with, but now isn't really the time. And I think that there are short-term concerns, certainly in the Treasury, about the impact of rising interest rates on government's financing costs. But I think you really would want to say two things in response to that. The first is that compared with most countries, we have very long maturity on our debt. So we're more insulated from changing interest rates than a lot of countries would be. But secondly, even if gilt yields do start to rise, that's probably an indication of increased growth and increased inflation expectations. And those two things should themselves help on the other side of the balance sheet to reduce the burden of our debt. So again, I think focusing on those financing costs is way off base. But then there's a big one. There's a big reason why I think that the government and the Chancellor are looking at tax increases right now, even when to most of us it doesn't make any sense for them to be doing so. And I think that is a sort of massive sense of pessimism about our policy future and our economic future. So I think there's an assumption that spending is going to have to be permanently higher after this pandemic than it was before. A sort of a thinking that we can't unwind everything that we've set in place, that the political will won't be there. I think there's a massive economic pessimism, which says that the economy is going to be permanently smaller as a result of the sort of scarring effects of this pandemic. And then thirdly, and this to me is the absolutely central one, it actually explains almost everything that's gone wrong with British government over the last 10 years and maybe more. And that is a sort of deep-seated belief in the Treasury and maybe elsewhere that economic growth is just something that happens and policymakers have to respond to, that they get what they're given in terms of economic growth, and there's not much they can do to influence it. And I think, if you put yourself in that mindset, a deeply pessimistic mindset about our prospects, you can understand why they'd be running around trying to think of ways to raise revenue and close the fiscal gap as quickly as they can. But they're not really grasping the crucial thing that they should be doing right now, which is putting economic growth absolutely front and center of everything they're thinking. Economic growth is really the answer to all of the questions. It makes the debt shrink. It makes your tax revenues rise. It makes promises you've made to an aging population more affordable, and so on and so forth. And for me, and I know I've probably gone on a bit, I don't want to eat into everybody else's time, but if I was advising the Chancellor, I would be saying, don't worry about the deficit right now. Worry about getting our economy to bounce back as robustly as possible. And basically put all your chips on economic growth. Do everything in your power to boost economic growth and make it as sustainable as you can. And of course, there's more to that than tax, lots more than tax. Planning reform, for example, is a big one. But there are tax things he could be doing in a budget that would help. Specifics, stamp duty, get rid of it. Full expensing. Let's do it. The Adam Smith Institute has campaigned wonderfully on this issue, the factory tax. And let's also look at reforming business rates so that they don't constitute an impediment to business investment. Those are all quite straightforward things that the Chancellor could be doing. And then I think there's maybe a longer term agenda that you could set to have a really, truly competitive tax system internationally. And I think they should resurrect the old 2010 pledge to have the most competitive tax system in the G20. And, look, I'll leave it there. There's probably quite a lot that we can come back to in questions, and I'm very interested to hear what my fellow panelists have to say.
Thank you, Tom. So they're focusing on the wrong things. They're focusing in the wrong places. Emma, where do you think the focus should be for the Chancellor? Which group should he be focusing on? And how should he get growth up? Over to you.
Well, I think first I'd like to start by saying it's very unfair of you, Matt, to allow Tom to make the opening comments when they are as comprehensive and wide-ranging as they are. He's left very little space for the rest of us to chip in. I fear we may agree. I think one of the points that Tom didn't mention, actually, in terms of how we've come to this position when we have a Conservative Chancellor setting out his plans to raise seemingly every tax under the sun, and the Labour Shadow Chancellor saying, "Oh no, now is not the time," is actually it's a political calculation as much as anything, that he feels tax rises are inevitable because, as Tom pointed out, the Chancellor is quite pessimistic and doesn't believe that economic growth is something that he himself can help engineer. But actually, I think that government seems to believe that tax rises will be inevitable. So let's bring them in now in the hope that the economy does recover so that we can cut them again in time for the next general election. Because everyone knows if you're heading into a general election, tax cuts or higher spending are going to be the things you want to do. And you would hope that a Conservative Chancellor is aiming for tax cuts. So he thinks if he brings them in now, then he can get sort of the damage out of the way relatively early on in a parliament and actually cut them in time for a general election in 2024. I think this is a very risky gamble. As Tom said, I don't think it's something that he necessarily needs to do. And actually, now is not just a time not to be raising tax, but it is actually an ideal time to be looking at a radical tax simplification, tax cutting agenda. The Institute of Economic Affairs yesterday published a report on 20 taxes that could be scrapped. Now, that's a catchy title, actually. We're saying that we should scrap some of them and reform, reduce and simplify some others. But actually, what businesses need in order to grow, and that's the only way, actually, we're going to see our way out of this pandemic-induced slump, is a simpler tax system that reduces the burden on business, whether that's new businesses being set up or businesses that want to expand and create more employment opportunities that we're going to need to stave off mass unemployment. And what we have currently is a tax system that every single day gets more complex with more loopholes and more economic distortions. I think it was The Telegraph who reported over the weekend that the Conservative Party since 2010 has raised over 1,000 different taxes in different ways, different tinkering. That's not what we expect from successive Conservative governments. And now is the time to be considering what taxes have moved far away from their purpose, what taxes are actually disincentivizing the expansion of businesses and the creation of job opportunities. I think another thing that we also need to consider is what Rishi's purpose is when it comes to raising tax. It might be that he is considering covering the COVID spending, which, although many people on this panel and in the audience might say that is a noble aim, now is not the time, but the spending does need to be covered eventually, so I can understand his motivation. There's also a possibility that he's aiming to raise tax to cover more spending splurges. This is a government that's been elected on the back of voters that don't normally vote Conservative and very much feel that they are lacking investment opportunities in their local area. A lot of red wall voters think actually we've been neglected. More spending is what is the way to boost my local area. And it should be the Conservatives who are making the argument that actually what we need is more private enterprise in your local area, not more state spending. I think this government is at risk of falling prey to the idea that actually a slightly nicer high street and government spending, public taxpayers' money spent on new roads, new bridges and new infrastructure is the way to keep those voters happy. So I'm quite concerned that that's actually Rishi's primary motivation isn't necessarily covering COVID spend. It's wooing voters instead.
Well, that is a question and a half. Actually, I think I'm going to hand it straight over to John. What is the point of Rishi? John O'Connell is from the swanky, brand new Taxpayers Alliance Media Centre,
which I hope is working after all of that. Thanks, Matt, and thanks to the Adam Smith Institute for having me this evening. What is the point of Rishi? I suppose I can sort of address that question from something that Emma alluded to in her comments. She was talking about a Telegraph story on the weekend of over 1,000 tax increases from the Conservatives since 2010. And that was a piece of work that we put together, actually. Since 2010, there's been 1,651 tax changes, of which 1,034 or 63% were tax rises. And I think there's some interesting questions here. And I try to group, or I'm going to try to group my comments into three broad themes. And the first one being, now is not the time for tax rises, which is an unsurprising thing for me to say, perhaps. But we know now that the tax burden is at its highest sustained level since about 1951, the highest level in 70 years. Again, that was another piece of Taxpayers Alliance research. But all we're hearing about is potential increases in corporation tax, capital gains tax, income tax through freezing thresholds, new taxes even along the lines of, say, an online sales tax or an online sales delivery tax, an excessive profits tax, or a temporary wealth tax as well. And addressing some of these issues here with voters in the red wall. Tom mentioned in his comments, actually, no, sorry, I think it was Matt, you mentioned that some of the increases to corporation tax might be seen as popular, where some work that the TPA did about a year ago, maybe it was a year and a half ago, we did some research, some polling work and focus grouping of our own. And we were specifically talking to people in the C2DE income bracket, which, for want of a better phrase, is working class taxpayers. And they were twice as likely as voters in the ABC1 categories to back cutting corporation tax. So the picture isn't as easy as saying, for the Conservatives, we've won all these new supporters in the Midlands and the North. We've got to spend more money and we can't cut tax because otherwise they'll be unhappy. The picture's actually a lot more mixed than that. And when we were talking to people in focus groups, in particular in Stoke, I remember one where we were talking about, big businesses in the area. They had a very acute sense that if you put up taxes on businesses, then those businesses would leave their areas and leave them with no jobs. They had a very, very sharp sense of that. So it isn't as easy as simply saying, there's a new bunch of red wall voters who we need to please with higher spending. So tax cuts are actually on their agenda, but in general, now is not the time for tax rises. The second thing I'd say, and it's slightly counter to Tom, actually, I would say that we should always worry about the debt and the deficit. And I understand all of Tom's points, and they're all eloquently put across. And, we're locking in seriously low rates, and there's a coherent argument that it would be silly not to borrow money, finding a £1 trillion note on the street and not picking it up. And Tom made a great case for focusing on growth and growth alone and its sort of virtuous impact on the debt over time. And that's all true. But to my mind, we should always be aware of the shape of the public finances, and getting them repaired to some degree in the 2010s meant that we came into this crisis with the room to act with a little more sort of decisiveness in the way that at the start of the pandemic. And I think we need to have some of that room for the next emergency, because there will be one. And if we go into the next emergency with our public finances all over the shop, then you can bet that we won't be able to deal with it in the same way that we've been able to this time around. And I suppose the other thing that worries me about the rhetoric of not worrying about debts, not worrying about deficits, is where that could lead to in a rhetorical sense. Again, if we're not to some extent worried about the fundamentals, then why on earth should we worry about value for money anymore? What is the incentive to ensure that civil servants or local government or quangos are spending money wisely and working as hard as possible to get the most out of every pound, which you could argue they don't at the best of times, right? And we should always be concerned that spending other people's money on somebody else leads to waste. And if we say the results of that have nothing to worry about because we can borrow more and the debt's not a big problem, then I don't feel that we'll be able to get a grip on value in the way that we should. And that leads to my third broader comment, which is we need to talk about spending as well. This event is largely about the backdrop of constant stories about tax hikes from a conservative chancellor, but we do need to start thinking about and talking about spending too. I think it was Philip Hammond this morning in the news. He seems to be the first senior figure to say something about spending. Although apparently if insider reports are to be believed, then Rishi Sunak is also worried about spending in the longer term. But it's something that we, maybe in the broader debate, in the media debate, we need to be dealing with too, because there's this obviously narrative that everybody's fed up of austerity, so therefore you can't really touch public spending. It can only go one way, and that's up. And the government has a levelling up agenda, which can mean whatever you want it to. But sort of one of the versions of what levelling up means is that we need to spend more money on infrastructure, perhaps unglamorous projects in the North and in the Midlands and in areas that have been left behind. That's all fine. You can spend more money on all of that kind of stuff as you like, but we feel at the TPA that you should be mapping out a vision to save money to pay for it. It's not all about just hiking taxes to pay for this additional spending. We can't be spending over £1 trillion this year and have no more fat left to trim. So for my mind, yes, we can have a debate about taxes, and we of course feel that there shouldn't be big tax increases, any tax increases at this budget, but I think we need to shift the focus back onto spending too, because there's this perception that we're all tired of austerity, but we actually need to start talking about ways to deal with some of the scary scenarios you see in the OBR fiscal sustainability report, which make for scary reading out the fan charts out for decades hence. So it's not just about tax, it's about spending too.
Not just about tax and not just about spending, and also not just about us. The UK has a particular fascination with being a bit of a nasal-gazing nation, but when we're very much in an international game. The next guest, Daniel Bunn, works at the US-based Tax Foundation, and he looks at the international competitiveness of economies. How does the UK stack up, Daniel? And is there anything that the Chancellor could do tomorrow to help us become more competitive as we leave the pandemic behind?
So to answer the question in short form, the UK doesn't stack up very well. And interestingly enough, one of the conversation topics with this budget coming tomorrow, the potential for a corporate tax rate rise, is also a conversation that we're having in the US. President Biden is looking at a potential corporate tax rate rise here as well. But for the UK on our International Tax Competitiveness Index, which ranks the 36 OECD countries on the structure of their tax system, thinks through the distortions that different taxes create and whether or not a tax system is designed to raise revenue well without really damaging the economy in the long run. The UK ranks around 22nd in that index, which is not great. It's not something to write home about, not something to really be excited about, but different parts of the tax system rank, slightly better than other parts. And I think it's worth looking at where the UK does sometimes do well and where it kind of falls down in other areas. I think it's important that a lot of times when people think about tax policy, they think maybe, like John was talking about, the overall tax take, the tax as a share of GDP, or they think about the rate, think about maybe the corporate rate in the UK, which stands pretty competitively at 19%, below the average in the world in developed countries. But when you think about real tax policy and how it matters and how it can create distortions over the short and longer term, you have to think broader than the rate and the overall tax take. You have to think about the design of these taxes. And the International Tax Competitiveness Index uses 41 different variables to try to understand where these countries stack up. So I mentioned the UK ranks 22nd in the index, and that's its overall ranking. But it ranks rather poorly on property taxes. Tom mentioned the need to reform business rates. I think that's an important opportunity for this government to really look at how the structure of property taxes on businesses is damaging in the long term, damaging to their incentives to improve their property. The UK ranks relatively middle of the road on corporate taxes. I'll come back to that in a minute, but their rank on corporate taxes is 17. And then on individual taxes, the UK ranks 24th, and on consumption taxes, the VAT ranks 22nd. The UK ranks relatively well on cross-border tax rules, mainly due to its history of building up relationships with other countries and having a broad network of tax treaties and attractiveness to foreign investment. But that gets us back to the corporate tax. The corporate tax rate ranks 4th out of 36 as far as the OECD is concerned. It's a really competitive rate. But on the base, the UK tax system ranks 2nd to last. So we think when we're talking about the corporate tax base, there's 2 big features that I think are critical at this point in time for the UK's economy. Number 1 is cost recovery. Adam Smith Institute calls it the factory tax, and Tax Foundation calls it full expensing, but the ability for businesses to deduct their investment costs so that the corporate tax falls on the profits after accounting for investment costs. This is a critical feature to a pro-growth tax system. The US adopted full expensing for some capital assets in our tax reform in 2017. Canada brought something on for a temporary basis, and several other countries have brought in a temporary full expensing for capital assets. Now, we think this is a good approach for a long-term tax system to be able to incentivize businesses to invest in your country, to hire workers, and to be profitable, and to certainly return profits to shareholders. But it's something that currently in the UK tax system is holding that back. Certainly with a low rate, there are some features of the economy that really benefit from the low rate. But when you think about the heavy industrial or businesses that rely a lot on capital expenditure, even some of the new economy companies that rely on heavy CapEx to be able to build out infrastructure for things like 5G or other internet services, capital expenditure, full expensing can be a really powerful driver for growth over the long term. Now, another thing that is really critical right now is loss treatment. So when businesses run up losses, a lot of tax systems allow those companies to deduct those losses against future tax liability. In the UK, there's a limit on that. So in any given year, you can't deduct your full previous losses against your tax bill. In fact, there's a limit that's relatively strict among OECD countries on carrying forward those losses. Now, there's not necessarily a time limit, but there's an annual limit that applies to carrying those losses forward, and losses can only be carried back against 1 year. So if a company lost a lot of revenue, had significant losses in 2020, and those losses exceeded the tax bill that they paid in 2019, then it creates a friction of, oh, well, we've got to carry those forward against future profits, and loss limits can create this, I would say, volatility in understanding what your tax bill is going to be in any given year. I think there's been mention of potential carrybacks for 3 years. I think that would be a good approach in this budget to recognize that these businesses have accumulated losses that may exceed their tax liability from 2019 or even prior years, to be able to offset those tax bills and free up some cash for the economy. So I think those 2 important things, full expensing and broadening of loss, or removing limits on losses right now, would be important things going forward. Now, I think on the rate, a lot of times when you see the different ways that tax systems have designed their approach, you're seeing a lot of countries move towards the mid to low 20s on corporate tax rates, and the UK is not far below that. Like I said, it's relatively competitive right now, but over time, it's possible that these rates will cluster, and the UK maybe jumping up a couple points could put them right back in the middle of the pack. I think it's important to pay attention to that kind of international attractiveness for the UK economy, that things like the rate, full expensing might mean for companies investing in the UK, both UK domestic firms choosing to invest in UK plants and factories and jobs, but also foreign firms that may want to set up shop in the UK. But generally speaking, it's important to think about jobs and growth here. Obviously, the pandemic's still going on, as Tom mentioned at the top, lockdown's still going. But as we turn the corner here through vaccination, it's going to be very important to have things in place that don't hold back the opportunity to kind of move into a different gear on growth and bring jobs back.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And as you were just talking about what we call the factory tax and what you guys call full expensing, I thought I'd bring a comment that was sent to us by Dr. Vernon Smith, Nobel laureate, who says that the corporation tax is an insidious tax, known from studies by the MBER as reducing investment in plant, equipment, and human capital, and directly increasing unemployment. Its optimal level, he says, is 0. Tax is already paid on profit as income to the owners, and taxing it once is enough. Similarly, he says a wealth tax will reduce capital investments to pay the tax, thus transferring resources from commercial and industrial activity to government consumption. The way to tax consumption by the rich is to make investment savings deductible from income, to thus arrive at taxable consumption at progressive rates. Thank you very much, Bernard. And what an incredible thing to have such an illustrious guest in the audience. Tom, I thought I'd come back to you to ask, because Eamon Butler, our founder and director, always gets a question. He's come in, and he came in first. So Tom and John, I think we'll come straight to you guys and say, what do you expect to happen tomorrow? Not just from this kind of kite flying, but more generally in terms of what you've heard behind the scenes. Do you think that there will be extended business rates, rate relief? Do you think corporation tax will be up to 23%, 24%? I want your money where your mouth is. Give me the rates as well as the base.
And you want me first, Matt?
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that it's going to be quite as blockbuster a budget as maybe some of the trailed stories in the press would suggest. And certainly that's what you hear behind the scenes. Don't worry, it's not going to be as bad as all these stories make out. So I think basically what I'm expecting is that the Chancellor will extend a lot of the support schemes over the next 6 months, probably taper them off to a certain extent over that period. And that he'll combine that with probably one big headline tax increase, which I think will be corporation tax. And I'd expect maybe a couple of percentage points on the rate. Now, the interesting thing with corporation tax is to what extent it's an overall tax increase, because there have been rumors about making loss provisions more generous, making investment allowances more generous at the same time. So it's actually possible to have a slightly higher headline corporation tax rate. And if you deal with the tax base in the appropriate way, and it's kind of what Daniel was talking about just there, you could end up with a corporate tax system which is as pro-growth or maybe even more pro-growth overall. The devil's really in the detail there. And of course, any hike in the headline rate is going to hit small businesses who generally won't have sufficient losses or capital investments to exhaust the current allowances. And I'd also expect some kind of stealthy tax increases around freezing allowances and thresholds and so on. And I think one particularly pernicious one, which has been rumored and I think is quite likely to come to pass, unfortunately, is freezing the lifetime allowance for pension withdrawals, which is a tax measure that has all kinds of nasty impacts on saving and people in retirement, but because it's seen to only affect rich people and probably only affect rich people sometime in the distant future, so they can't get too upset about it right now, it's one of those things that politicians sort of love to go for. And I think there'll probably be some signaling for the future around things that I think the Chancellor genuinely believes, for example, that capital gains tax should be aligned with income tax rates. I think he's wrong, but he believes that quite genuinely. And then stuff around the self-employed and their national insurance contributions and everything. He flagged right at the beginning when he unveiled sort of support schemes for the self-employed that those taxes were likely to go up. So yeah, sort of short-term bad, but not as bad as some of the stories make out. Long-term, not a particularly attractive picture.
John, when Tom was mentioning some of the taxes there, you look like a bulldog swallowing a wasp. There was which ones most upset you, and which ones do you think most likely to happen tomorrow?
That's just my general demeanor when we're talking about subjects like this, Matt. I think listen, do you know what? Because I like long odds betting, I'm going to say that I don't think that there will be any significant tax changes tomorrow. I thought that it was really interesting that there was a leak on, I think it was Sunday into Monday. So in Monday's papers about how the OBR figures for the fiscal situation are actually going to be slightly rosier, or in fact, a lot rosier than we were led to believe maybe just a week ago or a fortnight ago. And that to me hinted at perhaps that there are going to be no significant tax changes whatsoever this time around. And what you might see is, as Tom said, an extension of VAT and business rates relief. And then obviously on the spending side, furlough and other such measures. And that he will leave decisions like tax increases, if there are to be any, for November. So I think that he will, again, long odds betting, but I think he will duck it tomorrow and look at it again in November. But I think politically it plays well for him to be thinking about the state of the public finances, being a sort of true blue Tory that, is worried about balancing the books. So I think that, he may see it as some sort of, small victory that he was able to paint a image of himself as somebody who's worried about the fiscal picture, but will delay the decision till November.
Emma, do you agree? Do you think that sort of fiscal consolidation, this sort of Rishi the accountant, rather than Rishi the Chancellor, is going to play out tomorrow?
I'd like to be as optimistic. Well, not that John was optimistic necessarily, but at least about tomorrow, that it might not be as bad as we think. And I think, that if that does come to pass, it would be an interesting calculation, because people like us who've been very negative and worried it's going to be a complete disaster go, oh, it wasn't as bad as I thought. And that actually he's still done things that we wouldn't have necessarily approved of in normal times. So if it's about expectation management, then I'd probably give number 11 a little bit of credit. I think it's important to note there are certain things that Rishi can't do tomorrow because the Conservative manifesto is backed into a corner. So with the tax triple lock, for example, the Conservatives are very committed to not raising the rate of VAT, national insurance, or income tax. And I think actually what would be a lot more damaging, especially for the general public on low incomes, is if we see a freeze in the increase of the threshold of income tax. I think that's much more likely to come. And that is inevitable when you make these manifesto promises. You're basically just beholden to fortune, basically. And we couldn't have predicted anything quite as bad as the pandemic, but he has backed himself into a corner ever so slightly with this. I'm also quite concerned about whether we see a digital services tax, some kind of punitive punishment on businesses that are seen to have profited from the pandemic. I think what that actually means is they were businesses that were incredibly useful during the pandemic, and everyone was delighted that actually they could still get a takeaway to their house or buy things that they needed, especially for working from home, for example. I'm sat here with a ring light and a riser for the laptop, so I'm not an incredibly painful angle working 8 hours a day. I don't think Amazon should be punished for the fact that was able to arrive at my house in under 24 hours. I think that might be packaged under green levies as well. The idea that all of these delivery drivers are having a very negative impact on the environment, bringing us things we all actually want and can't get out to buy ourselves. But I think we'll probably have to wait and see.
Yes, I think the sort of what we've termed the disability tax, the tax on people who've been shielding, the tax on people who are vulnerable, who've still been able to get what they need, still been able to get medicine, food. I think it's quite a pernicious one, that the idea that it's a tax just on big tech and big billionaires in Silicon Valley. It's actually really a tax on everybody who's been locked away by the governments that have been running.
Well, it's also an attack on every small business that has not been able to operate in the normal fashion, but has adapted to the crisis and still been able to serve their customers. Those businesses that have transitioned to selling things online that they didn't ordinarily do before, they should be celebrated for adapting their business model, not punished with a new tax.
And yeah. Matt, could I just quickly add on that as well? The next time that there's any sort of emergency, if we did put a retrospective taxation on Amazon or another company, any other company that has provided goods and services during this pandemic, if we put a retrospective taxation on them for their success, what incentive is there for a company to support the economy during the next emergency? If they're being told, if you do well during this emergency, we'll just screw you afterwards. So I think it's really important that they don't send the wrong signals with stuff like that.
Yeah, and I thought of Daniel, in the first time there were windfall tax or like retribution in a in a sort of a republic was the late Roman Republic, so like 379 AD. You saw the emperor starting to steal property to try and pay off large-scale debts that they built up in emergency situations. They come up every now and then as these one-off situations, but they always seem to appear. And what message does it send to other countries and investors who are looking at a global picture when a country deems itself to be in such a one-off emergency situation that it can destroy all norms in such a way?
Oh man, one-off taxes, very bad. Retrospective taxes, even worse. It's really poor for incentives for, like we've said, you can't plan for a pandemic. Some of the, wartime profits taxes or excess profits taxes after the wars, they weren't things that companies could plan and prepare for. It's very burdensome because essentially you're creating a structure on top of the existing structure and saying, hey, we need to, look at your records from the past 4 or 5 years, figure out if you're making more than you would have otherwise during this crisis. And then we're going to adjust your tax base for various costs and things like that. And it's a really, really big headache, both for the government to audit and administer the tax and for businesses to be able to figure out what they owe. I think it's a really bad way to do tax policy. And, my strong preference, just to make it clear to everybody, is for principled, long-term, stable policy. And that's certainly not something you get out of a one-time tax or something that's backward-looking.
And Tom, in terms of, you've looked at international competitiveness as well with Daniel, in fact. What would you say, you see, this is one of the things that always comes up in my mind, is that you see concerted efforts on the left and in sort of trade union movements, explicitly with the international trade union movement, to have increases in various spendings or actions on an international level. Is there something that, movements on the right or typically more pro-business or more competitiveness should be working but at an international level to increase competition, or should we just be looking at a national picture every single time? And if so, what are they?
No, that's a great question. And you mentioned the work that I did with Daniel. I think someone might have popped the link in the Q&A there, but I'm very gratified to discover that if you Google UK tax reform, it is the first hit, thanks to the search engine optimization wizards at the Tax Foundation, no doubt, or just the extraordinary quality of our clear thinking on tax policy. That's our 100 pages will be right there. And what that whole project was about actually was trying to embed the idea of pro-growth UK tax reform in a more international framework. Because, for example, the government has committed in the past to have, say, the most competitive business tax regime in the G20. But it was never actually clear what that meant or how you could measure the degree of our tax competitiveness, right? And what it basically came down to was we'll keep cutting the headline rate until it's lower than everybody else's. And that's good, all for that. But you have to remember the government at that time, they were giving with one hand, but they were taking away with another by sort of tightening up on all the investment allowances and so on, particularly when it came to investment in structures and buildings. And so what we tried to do with our tax reform project was compare the UK on a whole, I think sort of 40 different variables that the Tax Foundation's index covers, and look at the specific areas where Britain does well and the specific areas where Britain does badly, and try and pinpoint those areas where we're struggling, and come up with reforms that would improve the situation. And so I think looking internationally is extremely important. Now, whether, as you say, there's much scope for a kind of international collaboration between those of us who believe in pro-growth policy and so on, I'm all for it, and the project we did is an example of that. We can do more, but ultimately, I think we don't have in the sort of free market movement, we're not going to have the kind of large-scale impact that, say, trade unions and these leftist groups can have in terms of just sheer numbers of people and organizations and coalitions around the world. So we have to focus primarily on persuading the people in power that our ideas are the best ones, and the ones that will deliver more economic growth, and probably by delivering more economic growth, deliver more votes for them in the long run. The problem is a lot of what we profess and believe in is kind of counterintuitive, or it runs contrary to sort of basic public opinions in many cases. You know, one of the big problems you face when you're talking about progressive tax reform is that the public loves taxing other people. They don't like paying taxes themselves. So probably the most efficient way to raise revenue without harming growth would be broadening the VAT base. Everyone hates that idea. Probably the worst thing you can do if you're prioritizing growth is increase the corporation tax rate. Well, lo and behold, lots of people seem to support that if you look at the polls. So, you know, it's a tricky one. We just have to keep fighting for the things we believe in.
Fair enough. And in terms of, we've actually looked at some polling as well from last year, when during the middle of the pandemic, and we found that young people were the most likely to support tax cuts, that they were most likely to support sort of business rates cuts, because they made that association, as John mentioned earlier in his polling as well, focus group, that it was directly their jobs that were most likely to be affected if the businesses were going under. And as young people were more likely to be involved in the public sector, in the private sector than the public sector, they were the most likely to understand that job security in a pandemic when their businesses were closed was most at risk. So I think sometimes politicians make assumptions about groups of people, especially right now when the real economy is still very much sort of under tarpaulin. They've put a sheet over it, and they're pretending that, you know, that it hasn't burnt, that there isn't a fire ongoing, and they don't want to look at the damage to see how bad it is. And so I think there's a level to which the tinkering that we'll see tomorrow, and I think this is my prediction, that we'll see tinkering a la New Labour style budgets, where they'll say, like, they'll go for headline grabbing announcements where they think that they'll look nice and good, but they will leave the real meat of how to deal with the economic consequences of the decisions made in the pandemic to try and reduce loss of life by removing the level of human interaction. They'll leave that for November. But that does mean that a lot of what we're going to see, I think, over the next few months, will be sort of announcements that don't reflect reality and don't reflect real people's experiences of the economy, especially outside of central London, and what people actually really need to get their lives restarted and to restart the choices. So don't be too surprised if it looks like it's out of touch and a little bit aloof, and maybe just the sort of policies that you'd expect to see from fast stream graduate kids out of in Whitehall. Now, Alan Simmons says, should we not be getting rid of corporation tax altogether? And it makes me sort of question. We're talking about, like, I think Daniel talked about the base. We were talking a little bit, in fact, about the rate of corporation tax. But I was wondering, should we go for something really bold, as maybe on the right more generally, and say something like we should get rid of all income tax? That this was a tax that was brought in the Napoleonic Wars, and isn't it time to recognise that the war's over, lads? We've stopped fighting it. Maybe it's time. In which case, Emma, like, what bold policy would you and the IEA put forward, rather than just tinkering at the edges ourselves? How can we move the Overton window?
I mean, I don't necessarily think it's as much about one bold move as actually you could do a whole series of bold moves. You know, if you're going to do it, and as you rightly point out, the public might not necessarily be with you, you might as well just go all in. There are quite a number of different taxes that could be bunched together and reformed in different ways. And it's not just about, you know, when people think about tax cuts, they think about paying tax. They don't necessarily think about the knock-on impact. So actually a reform of things like council tax and the community infrastructure levy and stamp duty, all of the, you know, taxes in and around housing and property value, that wouldn't just, you know, have an impact on people's pocket. Actually, if it injects movement into the housing market, it removes disincentives to building new houses, which I think we can all agree we absolutely need and would be incredibly popular with the kind of young people that Matt mentions who, you know, are already aware that these taxes have a very negative impact. No one's more aware than the negative impact of housing related tax on, you know, not just in normal times, but especially during a pandemic, if you've had to work from home in substandard housing without, in communal housing, I would like to see some very radical reform there rather than tinkering around the edges. Extending the stamp duty holiday is fine. I'm very happy that it's been done, but actually just scrap it entirely. We need to build tens of thousands more houses, as we go on, and any tax that's holding that back should be, on the chopping block as far as I'm concerned.
And John, which taxes can we reduce on the middle classes? I know that we talk a lot about sort of, corporations, businesses, but everyday ordinary families, how do we ensure that they're actually getting to see more of their pay packets at the end of the month?
Really tough question, in the sense that, cuts to income tax and things like that, they benefit people across all income deciles. So, if you want to zone in on that directly, or laser in on that directly, you are looking at things like duties. You're looking at things like alcohol duty. VAT is quite regressive also, but on the duty side, certainly those on lower incomes tend to spend a higher proportion of their post-tax income on things that attract a duty. So if you really wanted to sort of laser in on those on the lowest incomes, then duties would be where you look. I don't mind if I can also just answer a really sort of boring processy question, which answers your much more sexy question about what bold policy could we do. Just to throw that in there as well. I think if we got the Treasury to embrace dynamic tax scoring, we would be able to make a much more coherent and cogent argument for reducing taxation and not just in a sense to boost economic growth, but also to bring in more revenue. We could make the Laffer curve arguments no longer on the back of a napkin and properly in a modeled way. I think that would really help shift the tax debate in the UK and give us a much more strategic focus on leaving the room for growth.
And Tom, I think Theresa May once described the Adam Smith Institute as the provisional wing of the free market movement. But the CPS is always seen as a little bit more friendly to the Conservative Party, perhaps. The consensus appears to be forming, and Lord Hague was in the Telegraph today saying that tax rises are unopposable. The consensus appears to be forming that the Conservative Party only supports spending rises and tax rises. How do you guys sort of square the circle with being founded by Margaret Thatcher and a spending cutting and tax cutting based think tank along with that party?
I think it's increasingly difficult for all of us at times to strongly associate with the party in power at the moment, but we'll do our best to steer them in the right direction. I mean, I think that the big issue here for me, when it comes to public spending particularly, is that for quite a while we've relied on this argument that you can't spend because we're worried about the deficit, because interest rates might spike, because we'll spiral out of control, we'll sort of be Greece during the Eurozone crisis. And I have made those arguments myself in the past, I'll fully own up to it. I'm not sure that logically and intellectually, honestly, they fly at the moment, at least not when you're talking about a country like Britain. And I think you actually have to make the harder argument, a more difficult argument, but actually nevertheless a very true one, which is that spending isn't necessarily a good thing. Right? This is the politician's mindset that it's always good to spend money. Spending money, it helps the economy, it helps people, it gets us more votes and so on. But actually, spending often is unnecessary. Often it's destructive. Very frequently, it's very inefficient. And so, that's the argument that I think we have to make and persuade politicians that no, it's not just a free lunch when they spend money. You may be crowding out the private sector. You may be redistributing resources to somewhere where they are used far less efficiently than they would be if you left them in the hands of taxpayers and so on. And that I think is the lesson that Conservatives, and we're talking about sort of conservative politicians here, have largely forgotten. I think, Margaret Thatcher was no fan of the state and was focused on rolling back its frontiers and so on. And that kind of ideological drive is almost entirely absent in the current generation of Conservatives. And it's very hard to keep them under control when they don't have that mindset. And so that's something I think we need to try and re-inject back into the debate.
Fair enough. And Daniel, are there any lessons that we should be, or any things we should be looking at in the United States? Because quite often what happens is like debates that are had over there have a habit of trickling out over here as well. Are there any sort of icebergs on the horizon for Liberals in the UK to be worried about?
Well, I think what John said to carry over on a point that was made earlier on dynamic scoring, dynamic tax modeling. I think that's been something that's been a debate changer here in the U.S. To be able to show policymakers what a pro-growth tax reform looks like versus a tax reform that might cut a lot of taxes but not really do much for growth. To be able to compare those things apples to apples is really powerful. And I think Tax Foundation's model has been instrumental in changing the debate around taxes and growth here in the US. As far as what's on the horizon, it's interesting. I said it at the top of my remarks. The US and the UK are as far as I know, the only two developed countries that are looking at corporate tax rises right now. And I think it's unfortunate. I think it's not the correct direction that needs to go. But on the way potentially there, I think we really need to focus on the tax base. The US has a lot of scheduled changes to our taxes over the next few years, most of them that go in the wrong direction for competitiveness and for growth. And I think the lesson that I hope doesn't have to be learned in the UK is that temporary tax policy is pretty bad. So when I hear about a scheduled out corporate tax hike that might get reeled back in time for the election, I think that what's the whole point if the goal is for long-term growth? Why are we going to hike taxes now just so that we can cut them later? And I think for the U.S. we're at the opposite end of that. With our tax reform, a lot of taxes went down. And they're scheduled to go back up in just a few years. And it's a big political fight that's kind of down the road for us.
Fair enough. And I think we should be very honest that we've been very pro, at least the ASI have been very pro loose monetary policy during this period and relatively loose fiscal policy as well. And what the Chancellor is sort of saying, at least in trailing, is that he wants to have tight fiscal policy in future at unspecified date, but using this as a signpost to suggest that he still supports fiscal consolidation at some point, knowing that monetary policy is now out of his hands with the Bank of England being independent. The question, therefore, relies on us if we are not going to accept deficit spending forever and we don't want tax rises, where should we see tax spending cuts? And are there any boondoggle projects or fat to cut that you can see in the UK budget? And I highly suspect that the IEA and TPA might have a few. So I'm going to go to Emma first.
I mean, not to ever knowingly be off-brand, but the NHS, the amount of it's ring-fenced in consecutive budgets for exactly the reason that it is entirely unfeasible for a politician to stand up and say the NHS does not spend money efficiently, and therefore we're not going to give it more to spend even more inefficiently. But that is exactly what it does. And actually, that's not to say that the rate of money that we spend as a percentage of GDP on healthcare is too high. I would just rather it was people's individual money through their own social health insurance packages that they were able to purchase from the provider of their choice. If that meant that the amount as a nation we spent on healthcare went up, I'd be okay with that. I'd just rather it wasn't spent through a very inefficient monolithic system like the National Health Service.
John, go ahead. Give me your wish list.
Well, it's the easy and obvious one, but HS2, right? I mean, when you thought that there were no more reasons for it to be a bad project, COVID comes along and sort of changes the nature of how people may travel and go to work, and yet another case for not building this ridiculous £100 billion white elephant. But that's the easy stuff, right? It kind of reminds me of in the run up to the EU referendum. You sort of ask Brexiteers, okay, cut red tape, but what do you mean by cutting red tape? And they didn't really have any answers. And sometimes the same can happen with spending, right? But I think Looking at two specifically in the Quango sphere, I think getting to grips with the Quango state in general would be a good idea. I think that there's space, obviously, for small advisory organizations that operate arm's length from government, giving independent advice. I think that's a good example of the Quango state in operation. But I think two areas where it really needs slimming down are firstly in areas in which it should not be operating. So an example of that for me would be the Office for Civil Society. Civil society is by its nature operating outside of government. It does not need a government body to guide it. The second would be for organizations which have existed for a particular purpose to close down when they've achieved that said purpose. So specifically, again, to get specific, would be the Sports Ground Safety Authority. Yes, absolutely. You could argue it was very necessary, when particularly football grounds in the UK in the 80s and 90s were somewhat unsafe. But now that they're not, new stadia goes up all the time to very high specifications, maybe thanks to the Sports Ground Safety Authority, who knows? But they've done their job, closed them down, save some money. The problem with the Quango state, it accrues new functions every single year. So we need to be closing down organizations that have done their job, making them come before Parliament every single year to not only argue for their budget, but also to argue for their objectives, so there's no more mission creep, and we can really start to trim back the tentacles of the state that way.
Thank you for raising the Quangocracy, because that allows me to give my sort of favorite little piece of trivia if you ever need a pub quiz question. That there is a horse race betting levy board, but also a horse-based betting levy board appeals board, which sits to work out whether you've been ripped off at the bookies on a day-to-day race, and they actually fix the odds that you can get and be given at any given race, which is both egregious and ridiculous. But but it does exist, and it's someone who gets paid to fix the bookies against you. So there's one to go if anyone needs some fat to trim. Tomorrow will be budget day. I'm sure all of us will have statements out, issues out. We'd love to hear your thoughts as well. If you've got any ideas for massive tax cuts that the government could do instead of having tax increases, or spending cuts for any particular areas, do get in touch with us. And join us again next week when we'll be looking at the aftermath of this, as well as the outcome and maybe the roadmap out of the pandemic as well. Once again, thank you to Daniel, Tom, John, and Emma. And thank you to all of you for joining us. Have a lovely day, no matter where you are in the world. Good afternoon, good evening, and good night.